All right, welcome everyone. So glad you could join us tonight. This is our finale event of Sci-Fi September 2023 for the Mountain View Public Library. And we're so thrilled tonight to be joined by Ann Leckie. Also just want to remind everyone that this is an interactive event. We highly encourage you to use the Q&A, as some folks have already took advantage of there. We do have a chat function as well, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. And so let me introduce our speaker before we get started. So I'm sure you all are aware, but Ann Leckie is the author of the Hugo, Nebula, and Arthur C. Clarke Award-winning novel, Ancillary Justice. She's also the author of Ancillary Sword, Ancillary Mercy, Provenance, The Raven Tower, and most recently, Translation State. And she's zooming in tonight from St. Louis, Missouri. Thank you so much for joining us, Ann. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat with our community.
Oh, thank you for having me. I always enjoy talking with folks. It's one of the big surprising joys of being a published author.
Wonderful. So your most recent novel, as I said, Translation State, it just came out this summer. It's a standalone novel, but it's also set within the same universe of your award-winning Imperial Radch series. Could you tell us a bit about this latest novel of yours?
So Translation State is set outside the Radch, and it has three main POV characters who they end up being involved in things sort of tangential to the conclave, which is the conclave about admitting AIs as a significant species to the treaty. It's basically, at some point, a Presger translator has fled, has been lost, and they've been lost for quite some time. And so one of the main characters is looking for that person, which has become very important since making sure that everybody's keeping the treaty is really essential right now. So that's basically, I'm not sure how much more I can say without spoilers.
Sure.
But that's basically the book, yeah.
Great. And so what made you decide? I know it's not directly related, it's not considered a sequel to any of those books, but it is kind of in that same universe. What made you decide to return to that universe?
Well, so the characters, a couple of the characters are actually, I'm going to say very old, as in I've had them in the back of my mind since around the time that I started writing Ancillary Justice. And I wasn't at the time under any contracts, but I was, like all of us, stuck at home because the whole world was shut down because of COVID. The world needed to be shut down because of COVID.
Yes.
But, you know, being stuck at home and not able to go anywhere safely or like socialize with other people in person, or it was really hard. I don't have to tell anybody listening, I think, that was a weird psychological space to be in. And I played, my kids play computer games. I haven't played many until very recently. My kids introduced me to Stardew Valley and Minecraft, and I played a lot of Minecraft. And then those characters just kind of kept coming back to the back of my mind. And finally, I was like, you know what? I think it's time to write that story because I can't stay cooped up in this house, not talking to people for much longer. So that's kind of how that happened. I think I'm not the only writer. I think a bunch of writers have had weird stuff come out, you know, during COVID. I know John Scalzi had a book that totally wasn't what was under contract, and he was like, yeah, but this is what my brain's writing, sorry. I think Martha Wells' Witch King is another book like that. I think there's a bunch of folks who have books like that coming out like this year and next year.
No, I mean, it makes sense. It's such a strange situation that we all live through. You'd think it would have to spark some new ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So as mentioned earlier, this is the finale of our annual Sci-Fi September series of events we do every year where we celebrate sci-fi, fantasy, and science. You're, of course, most well known for your science fiction novels, but you've dabbled in fantasy as well. Who are some of your earliest influences in these genres? And as a follow-up to that, why science fiction? Why write science fiction? Why is it important?
So my earliest influences were people like Andre Norton, Jack Vance, CJ Cherry. I think those would be the big immediate names, but I'm sure there's a bunch of other folks who I just don't remember who they are. I lived within an easy walk to the local public library, and I spent most of my Saturdays in the kids section of the local public library. And when I became aware of the better selection across the hall in the grown-up section, the grown-up section of the library, I realized I could walk behind the area where the librarians stood and get into the adult section without them seeing, because they actually told me I couldn't go over there when I first tried to go over there. So I read a lot of stuff that I probably don't remember very well, but I'm sure it's all gotten down in there. I honestly don't know why science fiction. It is a little bit odd because my parents did not approve of that particular taste of mine. My parents really believed, and they're right about this. Well, first of all, this was weird. They believed from when I was small that I was going to become a writer, which is unusual. And I don't know what made them think that. And so they were always trying to like give me information that I might need as a writer, or, hand me the books that I wanted to read. But they wanted me to read quality stuff. And so they were like, well, but science fiction is just like pulpy kid stuff. What they really wanted me to write was detective novels, because detective novels, they're right about this, detective novels could be real literature, like real profound examinations of psychology and human emotion. And they're correct, but they were correct, rest their souls. But since they read a lot of detective novels, obviously, so they understood the genre very well. They didn't read science fiction and fantasy. They didn't understand it. They saw it very shallowly. But by the time I was about 13 or 14, they realized I wasn't going to grow out of it. And so they were like, okay, all right, we'll look around and see if we can find highbrow science fiction to give her for her birthday, right? I have no idea why I started on science fiction. I couldn't tell you. Well, actually, I could have a theory, but when I was about 4, this was a big event in my life. When I was about 4, the adult who at the time was responsible for me in a particular week, who was not a very responsible adult, wanted to go see the screening of 2001 at a local theater. And I suspect had no one to watch me. And so I was 4 and I saw 2001 on the big screen. And that did leave quite an impression. That left a huge impression on me. I was drawing pictures of Hal and Dave when I was in kindergarten, and nobody knew what the heck to do with that. That was, so that may have been what happened. But I still write science fiction because I love science fiction. I've loved it ever since I was a kid. And I don't think I can make a claim for it being better or more important than any other genre. Every genre and every form has its own advantages and disadvantages and uses. But science fiction does let us look at our present situation from angles that it's difficult to look from in other genres, right? You can really turn things around and sideways and upside down and inside out in ways that you can do with other genres, but it's more difficult. Also, it's just cool, right?
Absolutely, I agree. And so you touched on something I was actually going to ask you about, is that you mentioned how your parents kind of discounted sci-fi as sort of this pulpy thing. It's I feel like all genre fiction tends to kind of get put into a bucket over here, and then this is real literature. Do you think that attitude has started to change? I know that there's really been kind of a renaissance in science fiction that you were a major part of over the last decade.
I think it's changed a lot. When I was in high school, there was a science fiction class, which I thought was a quarter course in, the literature class that people could take, which I thought was very unusual and daring and cool of my high school. But like, there weren't people teaching science fiction texts in university literature when I was there that I know of, right? That just wasn't a thing. There were a few authors, you know, Le Guin usually gets some acknowledgement. I'll name, but it's controversial for a number of reasons, Margaret Atwood, who gets attention from the literary, who did, and even in the past got attention from more literary folks. But I also think the 70s happened. Star Wars came out. And Star Wars was such a huge phenomenon, and it had such an impact on popular culture that writers who grew up to write literature grew up with a science fiction background, even if it was only a very shallow one. And they're used to the tools and tropes of science fiction, and they don't think anything of using them. You got people like Michael Chabon. You've got, and I know I'm going to say her name wrong because I don't know how she says the St. John St. John part, Emily St. John Mandel, right? Who is very clearly a literary writer and is very clearly comfortable writing science fiction, and very clearly loves science fiction, or she wouldn't write what she writes. There's a lot of folks like that. Atwood herself loves science fiction. It's absolutely clear from her writing. There's more and more people who grow up sort of marinating in science fiction. So there are some holdouts. I'll tell an anecdote. Here I am thinking, yeah, that snobbery is there, but it's hardly there. And, you know, there's been a lot of change. My daughter, a few years ago, decided to take in college an ecology and literature course. And so they read Oryx and Crake, which my daughter adored. It's a fabulous book.
All right, excellent.
Yeah. And she came home and she said, please don't be mad at my professor. And I was like, what? And she said, this is what he said. He said, okay, we're going to start on the Oryx and Crake next time. I know you guys look at it and you might be worried that it's science fiction, but don't worry, it's not science fiction. Science fiction is like laser guns and pew pew and spaceships and stuff. Oryx and Crake is a realistic examination and extrapolation of what future technology might be. And I looked at my daughter and she was like, I know, he said it. I didn't say it. So, you know, that's still kind of there. I mean, Oryx and Crake is so clearly science fiction. I mean, there's no ambiguity about it. To have him stand up and say, don't worry, this isn't science fiction, it's speculative fiction. And like, so it's still out there, but it's not anywhere near the levels that sometimes people assume it is. It really has changed a lot.
Yeah, and I've actually seen an interview with Margaret Atwood where she makes that same assertion that no, it is not science fiction. So clearly that idea does still persist.
Oh yeah, that idea does persist. I recall hearing, this was a while ago on the Coode Street podcast, that when Ursula Le Guin, rest her soul, was saying she was friends with Atwood and saying that she and Atwood had a long and serious conversation setting Atwood straight about that. And so I can only presume that Atwood knows better and possibly has not said that sort of thing since, right? I suspect a lot of people are like, well, Atwood is too snobby. I suspect that Atwood, as a longtime reader of science fiction, literary science fiction is kind of its own different thing. And she may well have felt that she didn't quite fit into what was being sold as science fiction, and didn't feel comfortable claiming that. She wouldn't be the only author to feel that way. I know a number of authors who have felt, I think Kat Valenti once said, she felt like she couldn't write science fiction because she wasn't like an engineer or a physicist or something. I'm like, that's not how it works, right? And so I give Atwood the benefit of the doubt, and I assume that's where she was working from. Like, oh, I couldn't do that. Obviously, she's doing that, right?
So we received a really good question here, so I'll go ahead and get to that. And yeah, folks in the audience, feel free to continue submitting questions. I'll be kind of interspersing audience questions with my own. So this is from Laurel, saying, I love the way that you play with diverse expressions of gender in your characters. What drives your interest in gender in your novels?
So that's an interest that has developed over time. When I first started envisioning the world that the Imperial Radch books are set in, I wanted it to be a world where nobody cared about gender, partly because, I mean, I live in this world and everybody's like, gotta know which one of two genders you are. Gotta know. If I can't tell, there's a problem. I'm getting very upset. I've actually seen people get very upset over that, which is ridiculous, but you know. And I was like, I want to not have to care about any of that. I just want that not to be in the story. And I tried writing drafts and stories set in that world, where I would just assign what I thought were random binary genders to characters. And that wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. Plus, I was assigning characters depending on gender stereotypes, even in very subtle ways. So I tried writing a story, thank goodness I never sold it, where everyone was he, and then just explaining in a footnote, right? But it read just like a normal science fiction story. Nobody, would have gotten the effect that I was after. And then I was like, I knew that Le Guin, I hadn't read The Left Hand of Darkness, but I knew that Le Guin had been faced with a similar problem, made the solution to use he for everyone. And years later, it had gone back and said, but maybe I should have used she. And I thought, well, what if I use she? Oh, that would be really weird. And I said to myself, but you know what the good thing about writing is? If you do something and it's a mistake and it's horrible, nobody's hurt, there's no blood, there's no broken bones, and it's really easy to get rid of. You just delete it. And so I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to write it. And I recommend this course for all the aspiring writers out there. Go ahead and do that, because no one will be hurt and you can delete it if you hate it. So, but the more I wrote, the more I liked the weirdness. Well, that got me really thinking, because the weirdness really made the assumption of gender visible, right? Using he for everybody doesn't do it, but using she for everybody makes it clear that, first of all, he is not ungendered, even when you use it as such. And secondly, that using it as a default is suppressing information or erasing things. And that started conversations among my readers, on top of the thoughts it started in me, because those were new thoughts for me. And the more I listened to those conversations, the more fascinated and interested I became in all the different ways people talk about and experience and express their gender. And I'm like, this is science fiction. Why does it have to be, it's all housewives in suburbia and the men are on the spaceship smoking cigars and doing equations with slide rules, right? Why can't we think of something different? Well, I know why. It's hard to think of something really different. But so I do now, because I know about those conversations and have spent some time thinking about them and listening to them. I do, when I sit down and try and build worlds, actively think about, well, how do I want to handle gender? And so that's been, thank you, all my readers. I really appreciate just hearing folks talk about things and ask me questions and, make little shit posts and stuff. I really enjoy that. And it's really a learning process for me.
Great. And we received some more good questions from the audience. So Kate was asking, what was it like to put words around/in the mouths of incredibly large objects? And I would kind of follow up with that, which it's such a unique premise of your novel. That's, essentially a gigantic starship is the protagonist, and it's living within this human form. How did that idea come about? And was that kind of a hard sell initially when you pitched that to publishers to wrap their head around that?
Oh, that didn't even cause them to blink. Not even a second thought. And for me, it just came naturally out of once I thought of characters who had multiple bodies, the idea of ships that operated bodies just sort of flowed naturally from that. And then I was just like, well, I mean, they're characters, and I am going to assume that the questioner is also referring to Strength and Patience of the Hill, who is also a large object, although not as large as a spaceship. And that one was just, Strength and Patience of the Hill was just super fun to write. I don't know, just a great person to spend time with. I really enjoyed Strength and Patience's voice. So that wasn't that was one of those things that just kind of flowed out of the story. The actual thing I got pushed back, and not as much as I thought I would, was the pronouns.
Mm.
Yeah, I actually had someone tell me that someone who should know and who was not being malicious at all, saying, this book is really awesome and you will never sell it. And I was like, you're right. I absolutely believed that person was correct. But that wasn't going to stop me. It's another lesson for all you aspiring writers out there: be bloody minded and do it anyway. But no, the speaking from the point of view of a huge object, not a big dumb object, a big smart object, was not a thing that anybody blinked at.
Well, and so clearly that individual was very wrong when he said that.
Yeah, and like I said, I thought they were correct, and they were speaking, they were not speaking maliciously at all. They really liked the book a lot, and they loved the pronoun thing, and they were like, oh my God. And I'm like, I'm glad to have been proved wrong about that.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, I know novelists don't write for the critics, they don't write for the awards, but I'm curious, what was that experience like when your first debut novel you released to the world won the most prestigious awards you could imagine in the world of science fiction?
That was a hallucinatory year. That whole year, I was convinced that at any moment I was going to wake up in the hospital, and like my husband would be leaning over me saying, oh, honey, you've been in a terrible accident. A truck ran into the car. You've been in a coma. You've dreamed everything, right? But it wasn't. I went through that whole year just like, is this really happening? Because I mean, I think every science fiction and fantasy writer probably secretly, I've done it. I don't do it anymore for obvious reasons, but I did do it when I was especially starting out. You know, you get out of the shower and you look in the mirror and you're drying your hair or whatever, and then you're like, oh, my Hugo acceptance speech. Thank you to my agent. And then you're like, that's really stupid, you know, and embarrassed. And you think, yeah, but wouldn't it be great? You know, but you know, I would have that moment and then I would say, yeah, but it isn't going to happen. So don't act like that's a thing you can count on. That's just, you know, it's fine to have a fantasy, but it's not going to happen. It happened. So it was all very, very weird. Yeah. Awesome, but weird.
I can imagine. So, you know, you've worked in a number of roles before becoming a full-time writer. You've had a full life. Your bio states that you worked as a waitress, recording engineer, rodman on a land surveying crew. Do you think that experience, kind of wearing many hats over the years, has had an impact on your writing?
I suspect it has. When I was younger and had only worked a couple of food service jobs, I used to sort of despair because I would see so many writer bios that would be like insurance salesman, EMT, you know, infantry in the army, you know, like, and I'd be like, how do you have a life like that? I will never have a life like that. I guess I can't be a reader or a writer, but you know, you rack up all kinds of experience as you go through life. So I didn't do all those things thinking, oh, this will be great for my career as a writer. But I do think it does make a difference to meet different sorts of people if you can. I think John Gardner, who's written one of the few writing advice books that I generally would recommend that I actually really like, said once in one of the two books that he wrote, that it actually wasn't required to have that kind of resume. What you needed was the ability to sit down with any sort of person from whatever background and be able to just talk to them, and hear from them what they have to tell you that might be helpful for your stories. And I think that's right. I think the varied resume just brings you into the ambit of more varied kind of people.
Absolutely. So a question here from Raquel saying, your world building is amazing. I feel like in your books, I've seen scenes and settings so different from things I've encountered before. What advice do you have for writers who want to build different and inventive worlds with different cultures and values?
So my advice is, first of all, read a lot of history and anthropology. And to that, I would also add sociology if that's your bag. Also, because part of the point of reading the anthropology and the history is to find pieces, right, to put together. Don't take a whole culture and just file off the serial numbers. Don't do that. Because you're bound, especially if it's not your culture. And by and large, if you're going to take a culture and file off the serial numbers, it's probably not going to be yours, because you wouldn't need to do that with your own. Because you're going to have understood it shallowly, and you're going to put it flat onto the page, and that's not going to do anything for anybody. Spend a lot of time looking at objects in museums and reading museum cards about them. Look at furniture. Pick up books about historical costuming. You may or may not use like any specific thing, but just seeing the variety of stuff that's out there is really going to help. And then assemble the things that you think are really cool together in patterns that you think are really awesome, right? When you do this, you're going to mostly avoid the risk of, oh, I'm going to make Native Americans, only they won't be Native Americans. And then you do something really offensive. You're not going to do that if you go, oh, I really like horses. Oh, I really love these gold cups. Okay, what kind of person, is going to live under the kind of government where it's a council that's a council of elders? Oh, what kind of houses are cool? I think, and so you're not going to make a prefab version of something that exists already. You're going to build something new out of elements that already exist. That would be my advice. And also, like I said, take the things you think are really cool, right? Put all the shiny stuff you can find into your box. And then when you're building your stuff, just go, oh, let me grab a shiny thing out of the box. And if it doesn't fit with your pattern, okay, pull out another shiny thing, right? But the more history and anthropology and sociology you read, the more true to life your assemblages will be once you build those.
And that's a great point that actually leads me to my next question here, which is that, the world of the Imperial Radch series is set thousands of years in the future, is populated by a variety of alien species, different cultures far-flung across the universe. When you first set out to create this world, how concerned were you with scientific realism and believability versus just wanting to craft a compelling narrative?
I was just crafting a compelling narrative, honestly. Now, once I actually started to seriously try to write, I did try to have at least a basic grounding in some of the scientific stuff. So, for instance, Justice of Torin, all the ships, and Breq can see hormone levels and all kinds of biological data about their crew members. And I knew that I was going to have some understanding of physiology and endocrinology, even if my sentences didn't say that, because I wanted the readers to believe that this was true, because I'm fully aware that, for instance, I spent years writing in food service, right? And if somebody would do something in a professional kitchen, I've actually seen it, and I know that that's not how a professional kitchen works. Oh, that throws me right out of the story, right? The big one is people locking themselves in freezers. No, that doesn't happen, right? Because it's a safety thing on the inside. Anyway, so I know I want to get at least those basic things right. I didn't always manage it because I'm not a scientist. I know there was when in the Ancillary Justice where Breq and Savardin jump off the bridge, I actually spent some time trying to figure out the math of how fast and how long they would be falling. And I just did some like cocktail napkin things. But there was at least one factor that I did not clearly understand, even though it was in my calculations. But it came out in a sentence that there was an assumption I was making that was not correct because I didn't understand what was going on. And in fact, a reviewer caught it and said, and I've always remembered this, the reviewer said, in any other case, I would think it was sloppy writing, but Leckie is not a sloppy writer. She didn't understand this. And I was like, oh, thank you. And I didn't understand it. I messed up the physics of this really basic dropping a thing off the bridge. I mean, that's like, how basic can you get? I did that in high school. So yeah. So I afterwards I try, but stuff like faster than light travel, there's no way. There's no way. Time dilation is totally going to have to be a thing. The physics totally doesn't work. I don't care. I need the big distances. I'm just not going to, I'm pretending it doesn't happen.
Yeah, and there's already a market of those hard sci-fi authors out there who really specialize in that
There
stuff.
sure is, and that's great stuff, and I love it, and I'm not writing that stuff.
It's not for everyone.
It's not for everyone.
A question here from Ken and Devin. What have you read recently that you've really enjoyed?
I'm glad I saw that early on, and so I can name 3 things because I wrote them down very quickly. These are mostly, only one of them is very, very new. So I was recommended by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and if y'all have not read Adrian Tchaikovsky, you totally should, because his work is fabulous. But he recommended to me a book by Sue Breq called Semiosis, and it's very good. It is not recent. I think it might be 10 years old. Please do, by all means, read Semiosis by Sue Breq, because it's excellent. Just out, I think, or maybe coming out next week, is The Jinbad of Shantiport by Samit Basu, which is so much fun. Just so much fun. I read it. I think they may have a blurb by now. I had read it and was like, I really love this. I have to think of a blurb. And I'm so bad at thinking of blurbs. And I never did think of one, and the deadline passed. And then I said something in my newsletter, and the editor emailed me and was like, thank you for saying it was nice in the newsletter. Can we put it on the book? And I'm like, yes, you can, because I totally meant to send you a blurb. So I highly recommend it. It's sort of a 1001 Nights kind of a thing. I mean, like explicitly so, but with like artificial intelligences, and it's really good. It's so good. I also strongly recommend a book called The Unraveling by Benjamin Rosenbaum. Benjamin Rosenbaum has written a lot of short fiction, a lot of amazing short fiction, has won or been nominated for a number of prestigious science fiction awards for his short fiction. I believe The Unraveling is his first novel. It's set in like super crazy far into the future in a society with 2 genders, but they absolutely are not masculine and feminine, and they absolutely do not map on. I mean, like it might seem like they do, but they don't, to masculine and feminine. And something happens, and there's a lot of conflict over the situation with genders. I strongly recommend The Unraveling by Benjamin Rosenbaum, particularly to folks who enjoy my book. It's a different kind of a book, but it's really awesome.
Great. Oh, someone even linked to one of the books you're talking about.
Oh, good, good.
Thank you, Jed.
Oh, it's Jed. Hi, Jed.
So in 2019, you released The Raven Tower, which was a bit of a 180 turn for you compared to your science fiction series. It was a fantasy novel kind of based on Hamlet. What inspired you to go in that direction?
Well, so it's interesting that you say it was a sort of a 180 turn. When I was writing mostly short fiction, I found very quickly that it was easier to sell my fantasy than my science fiction. And so I actually sold mostly fantasy stories when I was doing short fiction. And to the extent that people knew who I was at the time, they considered me a fantasy writer. And a few friends of mine were kind of disappointed that I came out with a science fiction novel. They were expecting that if I were to sell my first novel, it was going to be a fantasy novel set in the world where the Raven Tower is set, because most of my fantasy stories were set in that same world. And when I was finishing up the trilogy, and my agent said to me, so what do you want to do next? Because you know Orbit will almost certainly ask for another book from you. And I said, well, you know, I do fantasy too. And he went to Orbit and was like, she would like to write a fantasy novel. And they were like, no fantasy, only science fiction. And I kind of had a little sad. And a friend of mine said to me, Anne, after Ancillary Justice, if you wrote a fantasy novel and presented it to your editor, what do you think would happen? And I said, oh, you have a good point. So I sat down and wrote the fantasy novel. So and I was very glad that Orbit then said, oh yeah, actually we would like that fantasy novel.
So then do you ever see yourself returning back to that world and maybe making it into a larger series?
Oh, almost certainly. Almost certainly. That particular story is done. But that world is the premise is so simple, that it makes, for the universe, it makes it such a big world to do a lot of different kinds of stories in, that I will almost certainly come back to it. Probably not at least until after my next book is out, because the next book that I owe Orbit is contractually obligated to be set in the Imperial Radch universe. So I'll be still playing there. But after that, I don't know where I'll turn next. So, and the fantasy world is really a lot of fun.
Oh, that's exciting. And it seems like that's a pretty rare thing in your field to kind of dabble in both fantasy and sci-fi. I know there are certainly plenty of authors who do, but it seems like the vast majority of them kind of get pigeonholed into one genre.
I think that's oddly the case. I mean, growing up as a kid, I just assumed that most writers did both fantasy and science fiction. But clearly there are some writers who only do one. And I don't know which is more often, but I guess often the assumption is that there's some sort of dividing line. I'm going to start a fight on the internet. I don't think there's such a huge difference between the two. I think they both involve counterfactuals, and there is definitely a difference in feel. And there are definitely some things that are easier to do with science fiction and some things that are easier to do with fantasy, but I don't think there's a hard, bright line dividing them.
Absolutely. That's why
Don't at
Sci-Fi
me.
September, we celebrate sci-fi and fantasy.
Yeah.
So good question here from Dr. Sharon Kelly. Is there a good place to find your short works?
There will be, come, I think, April. There's a collection coming out from Orbit. It's got one totally brand new story in it, which is the title of the collection. So it's called The Lake of Souls, or I think it's just Lake of Souls without the. And I believe it is pre-orderable in the places where you pre-order your books. So that is absolutely a thing. In fact, I have the galley pages that I have to have looked over and turned in by next week. But yeah, there will be in April a place to get my short fiction.
Wow. And so I know that some of this was written in the past, of course, but over the past decade, you've cranked out quite a body of work. You must be very proficient. What's your writing process look like? Are you the kind of writer who has a set schedule and goes into your office in a particular time of day, or how do you write?
Well, I'm not that proficient. I mean, and I guess, compared to somebody like John Scalzi or Rusty Soul J. Lake, I'm not that kind of proficient. So in theory, yes, my writing process does involve a schedule where every day I sit down in my office at a particular time and do a certain number of words. In practice, what actually happens is I spend a few months reading, or maybe a few weeks reading, depending, for a shorter piece. And I spend a certain amount of time sitting on the couch, drinking tea and daydreaming. And then at some point I feel like I'm ready to write. And then I try to write at least 1,000 or 2,000 words a day, every day at my machine at a particular time. I tend to be more comfortable writing in the morning, which I think is from when my kids were in school. And so I would get up, get the kids off to school, get home, put the breakfast dishes in the dishwasher, and then I could sit down and write until about lunchtime, and then it would be time to go get kids from school. And that works for me generally. But I say I write every day, but when you're writing, the work isn't always putting words on the page. And I think that's an important thing to remember. I think very often, for better or for worse, science fiction and fantasy is a very commercial genre. And a lot of we're very good as a genre about giving good business advice to upcoming writers. And part of that is a focus on productivity. Make sure you're getting the words done. Make sure you're getting the words done. But often we neglect the sort of the less obviously productive stuff. Sometimes the work is you have to take a nap. Sometimes the work is you need to walk the dog. Sometimes the cat vacuuming is actually part of the work of doing the writing. And you need that time to sit around and daydream or read a graphic novel that you love, or go to a movie or talk to your friends and kick around some ideas with folks. Those things contribute a lot to the writing, and you do need to make time for those. So if you're not writing every day, don't kick yourself. If you're not getting 1,000 words a day, don't kick yourself. It's just time to be reading, or it's time to daydream, or it's time to take a break.
Great, thank you. Good question here from Raquel asking, so the relationships between your characters are always so varied and complex. I loved reading about Breq and Savardin. I apologize if I butchered that pronunciation.
You couldn't.
When you were writing, how did you design your characters to give rise to such great relationship dynamics?
That's an interesting question. And I guess I didn't think of it in those terms. I just thought of it in terms of, all right, I have these two characters. What are they going to say to each other? And it's much more interesting if they're kind of spiky and are uncomfortable with each other, or unhappy with each other, or are secretly longing for something that the other person doesn't know that they want, or, that's much more interesting to write, and it's much more interesting to read. But I don't sit down and purposely chart that out. That's part of, I think, what I do when I'm daydreaming or reading other books, or, staring at the wall, vacuuming the cat. And I know other writers have a much more concrete process for achieving that, and it works really well for them, but I'm not one of those people. So I'm afraid I can't be helpful with that. But I think it's similar to grab all the things you think are cool, which is, if you want your characters to have really cool interactions, well, make them do the things that you think would be really cool. Like, ooh, what would I want to read here? Don't worry about if somebody else would think it was silly or cringe, or, no. You think it'd be cool? You think it'd be dramatic? You think it would be, heartfelt? Put it on the page. Make them do it.
And I'm curious, do you have any ideas or novels that are in the works that are kind of just sitting on a shelf somewhere that you might come back to years later? Or are you pretty much on a timeline of, this is what's coming out from my publisher, this is what I plan next?
At the moment, I'm pretty much on the timeline. The only thing that's sitting on the shelf I don't think will ever see the light of day, which is my first two novels, which I wrote when I was afraid that I didn't have the skill to write Ancillary Justice. And so I was writing around the edges of Ancillary Justice. And I wrote them both for NaNoWriMo in succeeding years. So they're dreadful. They're just really dreadful. Well, my friends liked them, which really did encourage me to sit down and take the writing seriously, because my friends were like, wow, this is like a real book. Looking back now, I'm like, kind of, but yeah, serious problems. I don't think these will ever see the light of day, excuse me. So those are the only thing that I have in a trunk. There isn't anything that's I was waiting to write, because the thing that I was waiting to write, the thing that I was ambitiously going to write, was Ancillary Justice. And I decided that really I just had to fish or cut bait and write the thing, instead of waiting until I was ready. Because why am I waiting till I'm ready? Maybe I'll never be ready. So I might as well do it.
And so even on your deathbed, you don't want to release those early works to the world?
On my deathbed, I don't particularly want to, but I guess my kids will do what they want.
This question here from Sharon that I was going to ask you as well is, has there been any interest in a TV series or movies from the Ancillary series? I imagine there has to be.
Yeah, there is an option currently, and I cannot say much more about that. Obviously, any progress has been not happening
Yes.
on anything, and solidarity, right? Ain't crossing no picket lines. But as always with movie and TV things, projects get optioned and never start up, or start up and dissolve, for reasons that only make sense to people in TV land. So even if I said more about the option, it would possibly just make everybody excited for something that was never going to happen. So all I can really say is there's an option, and that may or may not ever amount to anything.
Yeah, I know it's always kind of a sensitive topic when I've had to bring that up in other authors.
Yeah.
There's so many moving parts and factors that are out of
There are
everyone's control.
tons of them, and the whole, you know, TV Hollywood stuff has its own whole like culture that is just so weird. I mean, it's weird to me. Obviously, you know, literary science fiction probably seems weird to folks, you know, from different work cultures. It's all mysterious, and I don't even understand any of it, but that's okay. It's cool. I can say there's an option. It's exciting.
Great. Good question here from Lauren in the audience. Thank you all, everyone in the audience, for all these awesome questions, by the way. Keep them coming. Good question from Lauren asking, I loved all the tea and teaware descriptions in the Ancillary series. Is this drawn from your personal love of tea, or does it serve another purpose in the story?
Well, it actually both. I do like tea a lot, and I have liked tea since I was a kid. I also really, really like C.J. Cherryh's Foreigner books, which I highly recommend. Start with the first one. I believe there's like 24 of them at this point or something. Maybe there's only 18. It's a big, long series at this point. And if you don't like the main character, you won't like the books. So if you get past the prologue and get to the main character and you don't like him, put him down, because you won't like it. But which is fine. Nobody's perfect. But in the Foreigner series, tea is extremely important to the Atevi, who are a humanoid alien race, who are very important in the books. And those books were a strong influence on parts of the way I designed the universe and parts of how I was thinking about the story. And so I put the tea in there at the beginning as a kind of a hat tip, right? There are a couple other little hat tips. There are a couple of, there's a station name, and there's something else. There's another word that were taken out of context from those novels and put in there. And I've known other readers of Cherry to go, oh, I saw that, right? And I'm like, yep, that's what that is. That's a little, you know, a salute. So that's really what the tea started out as. But of course, I had to do research, right? I drank so much tea. I got so many different teapots. I got a gaiwan. I got a variable temperature kettle. It was great. It was so fabulous. I mean, somebody had to do it, right? So yeah, it was a combination. It started out as fulfilling that particular need, but also kind of like the teaware in the second book. Once I put it in there, then I could pull it out again as needed. So anything that's a repeated element becomes a structural element, and you can load it up with sort of emotional valence as you repeat it. And so once I threw it in there, I could pull it out again and again for those moments, and also for props for characters to, you know, manipulate while they talked, and, you know, hold tensely while they're upset and whatever. And the teacups, the tea bowls became that also. I threw them in the first chapter of Ancillary Sword because I needed some reason for Collar 5 to stop and talk to Breq and to be upset. And I was like, all right, dishes. But once I'd thrown the dishes in there and established that the dishes were important to this character, I could keep pulling the dishes out until eventually it would be oh no, Color Five's gotten out the best dishes. Oh, this is a big thing. And that would make sense to the readers, right? Because I brought out the dishes enough that it just became a building block in the story.
That's great. And then someone said, please answer the tea question. So I'm glad that we got to that. So question here from John. Was it a conscious decision to lean so far into body horror for translation state?
No, it was not. And I didn't think of it as body horror either. So this was kind of odd. My daughter was laughing at me. I was reading one review when it first came out. It was like, oh, this is really disturbing. I had to put the book down. There was all this gross cannibalism. And I was like, gross cannibalism? This is a very warm and wholesome book. What? Oh, the gross cannibalism. It didn't feel like gross cannibalism when I was writing it, right? It was just how Kven is. I guess that probably says something terrible about me, but you know. Yeah, so it wasn't a conscious decision. It was just brought about by who the character is.
Okay. Question here from Mark asking, so the ancillary books have a narrative voice that's much more serious and military, dry compared to the tone in Provenance and Translation State. Did you find one easier to write than the other? How do you recommend developing such different styles?
I don't think I found one easier to write than the other. One of the ways to develop different styles is to read a lot of different styles and to read them in quantity and to notice when they're different. That sounds obvious, but it's not as obvious as it seems. So if you want to learn different voices, you want to listen to different voices. So I would actually recommend, if this is an ambition that you have, and it's actually not a bad thing to do anyway, literally write parodies. Like, take your favorite author and write a parody of their work. Pay attention to what words they use a lot. Pay attention to the kinds of sentences. Like Dickens uses very, very different sentences than Hemingway. That's a really extreme example. You look at Hemingway's sentences and you look at Dickens' sentences, and they're really, really different. Why? What makes them different? They have very different structures, right?
Yeah.
Write an imitation of, it doesn't have to be Dickens. Write an imitation of a Dickens sentence. Take a sentence and write it as Dickens, and then try, how would Hemingway say the same thing? How would Jane Austen say the same thing? How would C.J. Cherryh say the same thing? How would Isaac Asimov say the same thing? Because all those different authors would say different things, that they would say the same thing in slightly different ways. And they would all be in different contexts as well. But listen to people talk. Try not to make it obvious that you're listening to people talk, because they will find it creepy. But definitely listen to people talk. When you're in the airport, you're in a restaurant, you're at the post office, you're in the grocery store, listen to the things that people say and how they say them. And just over time, let that kind of soak in. And then when you're trying to write with a particular narrative voice, if you're writing a character in first person, say, or dialogue, what I do is I think, okay, what if I'm hearing this person talk? What do they sound like? Right? I know who they are, kind of. How do they sound? And that will come out in slightly different sentences. And that's just kind of practice, a lot of listening, a lot of doing it over and over again. But yeah, pay a lot of attention to how people say things.
Let's see, we have running out of time a little bit, but we maybe get to one or two more. Let's see. So Raquel asked an interesting question. Do you have a favorite running theme or a running joke or recurring event in your books? Do novelists do that, like Easter eggs, like video game developers?
Oh, I'm sure they do. I have a few, actually. The Radishes. Readers who know, they know. There was a joke about radishes in Ancillary Mercy. Oh, let me answer that one too, Ken and Devin. I want to get to that because that's an easy answer. the Radishes make an appearance in Translation State partly as an in-joke about the Radish joke in Ancillary Mercy. And Ancillary Sword. Is it an Ancillary Sword? Anyway, the Radishes are sort of an in-joke, and they've become kind of an in-joke. So who knows? There may be Radishes in the next book. I don't know yet. But I'm sure I'm not the only author who does that. Ken and Devon, yes, Ken and Devon. Will we ever learn the story of Breq's time in the Etran Tetrarchy? The answer is yes. It's already published. There's a short story. Now it's at Strange Horizons. It's called She Commands Me and I Obey, and it was published in 2 parts. However, if you want to wait, which you can, but you don't have to, it is in the collection that comes out in April.
Great. Let's see. Question from Kate. Do you enjoy audiobooks? Any recommendations in that format? That's an interesting question. I feel like
That is an interesting question.
Increased in popularity recently.
They really have, and I can absolutely understand why. You can't sit down and read a book while you wash dishes or do laundry or, you know, but you can listen. I actually have trouble with audiobooks that are unfamiliar books to me because I space out really easily. I will be listening along and then my mind will just wander off and I'll be thinking about another story or, you know, but what I do is I will listen to an audiobook of something familiar for like an hour or half an hour before I go to bed, as a way of sort of winding down. And I definitely have some that are in a rotation and that I will come back to over and over again. The audiobook of Susanna Clarke's Piranesi is amazing, absolutely amazing. I absolutely cannot recommend highly enough, and I'm sure everybody listening to me already knows about them. The audiobooks of the Murderbot books. Y'all know about Murderbot. I know you do. Those are great audiobooks. Trying to think, I've got Goblin Emperor. I really do enjoy the audiobook of the Goblin Emperor. Goblin Emperor is fabulous. And I really enjoy the audiobooks of the other 2 books, Witness for the Dead and Grief of Stones. Those are absolute favorites of mine. Adjoa Andoh, who reads the audiobooks of my works, is amazing. I have not listened to any of her narrations of my works more than like for a few seconds because I find that very weird. It's just very strange. But I love her narrations of other things. She has on Audible, she has a narration of Pride and Prejudice that I have in my rotation. She's fabulous. I think those are really my top favorites.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that. Do you have a say in who gets to narrate your books, or do you care?
I kind of do. I kind of did, I guess. When Ancillary Justice first came out, there wasn't immediately an audiobook. And so the publisher held audio rights. And so they sold audio rights to recorded books. And they had a lovely voice, Celeste Chula, read Ancillary Justice. Her voice is really beautiful, but they did not consult me. They were just like, Celeste Chula is reading this. And they set up a phone call with me about all my pronunciations. It was wonderful. And then the book was doing really well. So finally, the UK side of Orbit decided to produce an audiobook. And so they contacted me and they said, we're thinking of these 4 people and here are samples. Who would you prefer? And of course, they were all fabulous. But I got to Adjoa Andoh. I didn't realize who she was. I got to Adjoa Andoh's and I was like, oh, her. I want her. She's my preference. And so they got back to me and said, we have Adjoa Andoh. And I'm like, yay, that's wonderful. And so then they'd come back and say, well, do you mind if Adjoa Andoh? No, I don't mind if she does the next book. And so Provenance, do you mind if Adjoa? No, by all means, have Adjoa Andoh do Provenance. And for Translation State, they're like, well, we're thinking about having a different narrator for Translation State, or we could have Adjoa Andoh. And I'm like, I can see reasons to do a different narrator, and that would be awesome. But Adjoa Andoh was really awesome too. And so it was Adjoa Andoh, and I'm like, yay! I'm so lucky because she's so amazing.
Oh yeah, and with audiobooks, the narrator can really make or break it.
You bet, yeah.
Absolutely. So we're running out of time here, so I do just want to give you an opportunity before we leave. I know you've already touched upon some of your upcoming projects, but can you tell us a little bit about what you have going on? Is there anything you'd like to promote beyond your latest novel you'd like to talk about?
So, at the moment, there isn't much going on, except that during the month of November, basically, Cat Rambo, who's somebody whose work you should read, by the way, Cat Rambo is having a month-long writing workshop in a castle in Spain. And all the castle in Spain positions are already filled. I'm teaching for 1 week of that. She was like, "Do you want to teach in a castle in Spain?" I'm like, "Yeah." But there is an online component. So if you Google Cat Rambo Wayward Wormhole, and so you want to do Wayward Wormhole Light, you can sign up for just 1 week, which it's me, it's Kat, Sarah Pinsker, and Tobias Bickel are doing each of the 4 weeks. You can sign up for just 1 week. You can sign up for the whole month. It's not 100% cheap. It's not like $5, but if that's something you have the time for and or the funds for, that would be a really awesome, interesting thing to do. It's going to be like Zoom live during the class, but I believe there are also recordings if you can't sit up to be awake at 9 o'clock in the morning Barcelona time. But for any of you who are interested, by all means, check that out.
Great. And it looks like Jed just put the link in the chat for those.
Oh, good. Thank you, Jed.
So Ann, I just want to say thank you. It's really been a pleasure chatting with you. I'm so appreciative. The library is really appreciative of you spending this hour with our community. And thank you to everyone in the audience for asking such wonderful questions. It's really been a delightful hour spending with you.
It has been lovely. And my readers are awesome. You all always ask good questions. So, and libraries, support your local libraries. Where would we be without libraries, right? Where would I have been without a library when I was a kid? So thank you all. Thank you so much. This has been lovely.
Thank you. We appreciate that. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good, and thank you, Ann.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, everyone.